My name is Nader Hashemi. I'm sitting here in Denver with Ellis Goldberg talking about the state of Egyptian politics and the future of Egypt. Okay, Ellis Goldberg, thank you very much for joining us for these CMES conversations. I want us to start by asking you about the state of Egyptian politics today after the Mubarak ouster and the 3 years that have passed since then. And you described the Egyptian revolution of 2011 as a period of revolutionary upheaval, in contrast to how it's often described as a period of democratic transition. Could you say a bit more as to why you characterize Egypt post-Mubarak as a state of revolutionary upheaval?
I think of it as a period of revolutionary upheaval primarily because many of the institutions of the state were profoundly fractured, if not shattered, in the first 6 months of the uprising. The police withdrew from the streets. In fact, one Egyptian friend of mine described the events of February 2011 as the June 1967 of the Egyptian police. And it seems to me that by mid-March, when protesters were able to take over the Ministry of Interior buildings, that is to say, the police headquarters throughout much of Cairo, the security functions of the state were largely in abeyance. And my belief is at that point, the army was a very thin line, holding back a tremendous wave of potential change. That in fact, there were relatively few army units available to contain unrest in Cairo. And in fact, at most of the locations of the Ministry of Interior, it was really the ability of army officers to convince protesters to leave, but rather than anything else that prevented those buildings from being totally taken over. There was, of course, at that point, no organized political force that wanted to push things further. So in that sense, expectations of a revolution of the kind that happened in Russia or Iran turn out to have been groundless or perhaps misplaced. But I think the intensity and breadth of the popular uprising through March and even April were extremely broad, much broader than I think most people outside realize. And unlike democratic transitions, these events don't seem to have occurred primarily because of splits in the old elite. They don't seem to have occurred because of the death of the old leader or because of an incapacity of the old regime to carry forward. This seems to have been a wave of popular protest that rose up unexpectedly from the bottom.
And are you surprised by the reassertion of the old deep state, sort of recapturing politics, crushing the street protests, and now sort of reinstalling or installing LCC as the new sort of, pharaoh that's governing Egypt? Did that shock you in terms of how things played themselves out?
I wouldn't say that I completely expected it, and certainly not that I desired it, but it didn't particularly surprise me. I think in looking back, it's fairly clear that the army and the judiciary were the two institutions that had the greatest support from large sections of the population and that remained largely intact across the period of the 3 years of the revolutionary upheaval. I also think that the army proved to be much better at tactically retreating when it was necessary, in ways that, as far as I can tell, no other political force was capable of doing. I can't say about how people in the army looked at things, but if you talk to members of the judiciary, and I did in 2011 and again in 2012, they were very profoundly dismayed, and they expected a tremendous transformation of Egypt that would sweep them away at that point. They were quite surprised, I think, at how things have turned out.
In retrospect, hindsight is 2020. What could have the Muslim Brotherhood and Morsi have done to have remained in power and kept this process of political change moving forward? Are there any sort of key decisions you look back that you would say that was, a big mistake that really, sealed their fate?
Yeah, I'm not sure there's anything they could have done to have remained in power. I think as we look at events in Tunisia, and it's fairly clear that the Tunisians and the Tunisian Islamists themselves learned from the experience in Egypt, really what the Muslim Brothers could have done was to have begun to give way to the popular discontent much earlier. There's no doubt in my mind now that by May or June of 2013, it was too late. I've also talked to leading members of the National Salvation Front, and at least the ones that I've talked to make it pretty clear that they don't see themselves as having led anything. They themselves were following a wave of popular discontent that swept over the country. So I think to have mastered that, or to have at least survived that wave, the Muslim Brothers would have had to have stepped back and probably agreed to some of the terms of the Tamarid demonstrators, that is to say, to hold new elections. Now, unlike some people, I think that was a constitutional possibility. I think they could have reinforced some concern for the Constitution had they done that appropriately in accord with the articles of the Constitution that they were passing. But it's also very clear that the Muslim Brothers, like most of the political leadership of Egypt over the last several decades, proved to be extremely stubborn.
The comparison with Tunisia is a fascinating one, because what we've seen in Tunisia over the last year, perhaps learning from the lessons of Egypt, is that you have to give concessions to the opposition. I just heard last week that the Tunisian Ennahda party has announced that they're not going to run a presidential candidate because they know to do that would sort of polarize society. It raises questions as to why Ennahda was able to do that as an Islamist party cut from the same basic cloth as the Muslim Brotherhood, but the Muslim Brotherhoods were not able to do that. Do you have any insight on that?
Well, I've thought about that a bit, and I've talked to friends, again, Egyptian friends who've spent quite a bit of time in Tunisia over the last year. Their belief is that the Tunisian political class is very different than the Egyptian one, much more able to talk across political boundaries that Egyptians find very difficult to surmount. But I think one other important aspect of this is simply Ghanouchi's own experience. In the case of Ennahda, you do have an Islamist party that's still run by its founder. So Rashid Ghanouchi has tremendous ability to change course for Ennahda in ways that probably didn't exist within the framework of the Muslim Brotherhood. The other thing that I think is important, might prove to be important, is Ghanouchi actually lived in England for quite a while. He's therefore is a political leader, and there are certainly other Tunisian political leaders as well, who've had quite a bit of experience with the process of democratic politics. If you think about Egypt, there are almost no political leaders today who have any experience with functioning democratic politics. That is to say, there are no longer any Egyptian political figures left who even remember what Egypt was like when it was a constitutional monarchy. And there are very few who have lived in exile and returned, because in Egypt, unlike Ghanouchi, in Egypt, once you go into exile, you basically give up any political role that you have. So there are no Egyptians who've had the experience that Ghanouchi had.
In a talk that you gave fairly recently, you sort of ended your talk on a fairly positive note, comparing where Egypt is today with the post-1952 coup d'etat period. And you made the point that back in 1952, when Nasser came in power, there was no interest in parliamentary politics or democracy. There was a lot of support for a strong man to sort of lead Egypt forward. In contrast to today, where you pointed out that, you know, there is, at least broadly speaking in the political culture, an attitude and a desire for democracy. Does that give you hope that that particular sort of at least value that you sort of identified could lead to some sort of democratic breakthrough in the future?
Sure. Well, as the late Palestinian psychiatrist Iyad Siraj pointed out to me once, optimism is something that we have internally. It's not something generated from the external environment. So I do have a certain amount of optimism. I would look at things in somewhat longer durée, I guess, if you can use the French and the English together. It seems to me, if you look at Egypt over the last century, really almost every generation there's been a popular upheaval, beginning in 1919, 1935, 1946-51, 1970-73, there was the Intifada of the students. Each one of those has had a significant but very limited effect on the structures of state power. 1919 basically established that Egypt would be independent, that it would not be a British colony, which is what the British had wanted to do before 1919. 1935 established that the constitution that tried to limit voting to 20% of the Egyptian population wouldn't stand, and so on and so forth. The 2011 uprising did establish that Egyptian presidents would no longer be elected by plebiscite, and that there would be more than one candidate. Now, seen in one way, that's a very immense sacrifice on the part of the Egyptian people to get what seems to be a very modest change in the structure of Egyptian power. And yet, it is remarkable that one part of the Constitution that hasn't changed since the 2011 plebiscite or referendum on the constitutional amendments is that part. And if we were thinking about a fascist regime or even the kind of regime that the generals imposed in Chile or in Brazil, you would think they would have gotten rid of that. And they haven't been able to. So it's not a very big change, but it may portend the possibility of other things in the future, and even of possible splits within the ranks of the military. So in that sense, I would say some important things did happen. They're not as big as we would like. They're not as big as the Egyptian people deserve, given the nature of the sacrifice that they made, but they are a step in the right direction.
Well, on that note, I want to thank you for being with us today.
Thank you very much
Thanks
for
a lot.
inviting me.
Thanks. Take care.